Hello everyone, thank you so much for clicking on this video. I want to talk to you about Saturn returns today because I feel like there's just a lot of misconceptions and fear around the idea of having a Saturn return, and it's not necessary. I also think that you can start to prepare for your Saturn return as early as you want. And it's better if you do, because then you can work at it and Saturn can end up giving you rewards when it returns instead of giving you lessons. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So first, let's talk about what Saturn rules over. Saturn rules over aging. It is the energy that is going to bring us into the next stage of adulthood. And anytime it squares our natal Saturn or opposes our natal Saturn or returns, is conjunct our natal Saturn, it's going to level us up into that next stage. Okay, it's going to mature us, it's going to grow us up, it's going to break us out of one loop, karmic loop, and put us into another. So yeah, Saturn also rules over karmas and lessons and the structures that we put on ourselves that keep us contained in certain karmic loops. So what happens is Saturn spends about 2.5 years in a sign. And so when you're born, you will have Saturn. Let's pretend you're born, right? You have Saturn in Aries. Years go by, it's in Taurus. Years go by, 2.5 more years go by, it's in Gemini. 2.5 years go by, now it's in Cancer. Okay, this would mean you're around 7, 9-ish years old. 7, 9, 8, maybe 10. I don't know, but that'll be your first square. And think about it. Around that age is kind of when you're moving from being a baby to like being in adolescence. You're kind of a little bit older. The way a 10-year-old talks and acts and thinks is much different than the way a 5-year-old talks, acts, and thinks. Like a 10-year-old's got a lot more, we've unlocked a little bit more of our brain. Your hormones might be changing too. You are a lot more cognizant. You're a lot more talkative. You can understand bigger and broader topics. You can have more mature conversations. You can handle bigger words. 10-year-olds, they could talk. They're really smart. So you kind of level up in age there, right? And then years go by, Saturn's in Leo. Years go by, Saturn's in Virgo, and then years go by, Saturn's in Libra now. You're around 14 to 16 years old, and you're having Saturn oppose you. So that's another key point. That is another point where you are leveling up. Again, and think about it. When you're a teenager, you're around that 14, 15 to 16. You're kind of, you're a very young adult now. You're not so much a kid. You are still a kid. You are still a child underage, but you are also maturing, thinking about college now, making plans for when you're out of high school. You might be experimenting with life, trying new stuff out. And it's also interesting how this is a point of opposition, right? From transiting Saturn to your natal Saturn. That is an opposition. That is typically a tough aspect. And this is a time where I think most people experience the most oppression around the teenage years, where there's just so many rules. The world feels like it's against you. There's so many rules. You're getting in trouble all the time. You feel like you want to just fly and expand and grow, but everyone says you're not ready yet. You want to, I'm thinking about myself when I was around that age, and I wanted to grow up and go to college already, but everyone was like, you're so young, don't rush, blah, blah, blah. I wanted to start wearing makeup, and my mom was like, no, you're too young to wear makeup. You hear that a lot, right? When you're around that age, you're too young. You're like, I want to be a billionaire, and everyone's like, shut up, you're too young, you're 16 years old, what? That's a dream. You're like, I want to go travel halfway across the world without my parents, and everyone's like, no, you can't. So if you think about it, there's a lot of the whole world is oppressing you. You can't get a job yet, so you can't make money, you can't really defend yourself yet. You're dealing with life still as a teenager. You're dealing with real life things, maybe not like things like an adult, but you're dealing with, things like growing up. You're dealing with things like peer pressure. You're dealing with things like, self-love and confidence and finding yourself and understanding yourself and, trying to make friends, trying to learn what love is, right? You're probably having your first, dance, first kiss and stuff like that when you're around this age. And so there's a lot of growing up that happens there as well. And then we have our second square before your return, and that'll happen around 19 to 22. And these are typically some really big years for people. And this is, I think, one of the toughest things to go through. At this age, you're trying to figure out who you're going to be. You are now an adult, and people are going to treat you like that, even though you don't know much about adulthood or life yet. You're leaving the nest. You're learning to take care of yourself. You're learning. You might also be experimenting and trying to find yourself. And you also still hear a lot of no's too. No, you're too young to rent that car. No, you're too young to drink if you're not 21 yet. No, you're too young to be in this shop if you're not 21. You still might hear some no's, and so you still might get that Saturn restriction, that Saturn discipline coming in. And I know when I was around this age, 19 to 22, that was the craziest years of my life. One of the biggest turning points ever. I ran away from home. I was living in an RV, and then that got stolen, and I literally lost everything I owned and had to move back home. It was crazy. So I ended a freaking 6-year relationship around that time. I lost a bunch of friends. It felt like my freaking life was falling apart, and I know other people who had a different lifestyle, went to college, and during this time period, they were struggling to balance their schedules. They were feeling a lot of restriction with time because of school and how busy they were. Some people were working a lot. That's another thing about Saturn energy, right? Is hard work. And so it's a tough time period as well. And that is another point where you're leveling up in adulthood. You're leveling up and you're maturing and you're getting older. And then years go by, we have, Saturn in Scorpio, Saturn in Sagittarius, Saturn in Capricorn, Saturn in whatever. Then you get your Saturn return. That's probably around, 27, 30 years old, depending on, the degree that your Saturn is at, if it's earlier or later. But you will have your Saturn return. And normally, this is an accumulation point. This should be a point where, you've kind of done a lot of maturing and leveling up, and you are going to mature and level up now, but you get rewards for it. You get rewards for all the hard work you were doing in college, and all that, and you get to graduate and get a job and buy a house, whatever, or you get rewards for all the healing you had to do, and, you get to move out, and you get to be on your own, and you get to sort of detox from all that healing. This is normally a point, I think, of accumulation, but because a lot of us aren't aware of our energy and Saturn's energy and how it's impacting us, this ends up becoming an accumulation of all the lessons that you've learned. Because if you weren't aware, you probably weren't learning those lessons, right? All of the lessons that you've learned, they can hit you all at once. They can hit you all at once here. Now, if you're aware and you're working with this energy, then you won't be hit with as many lessons. You might be hit with less. You might be hit with rewards. But if you're not, all those lessons from, these points of 7 to 9, 14 to 16, 19 to 22, it's we're forced to learn them now. And I think that's why this is important to talk about, because then, we can keep in mind okay, I'm at that age, 19 to 22 or whatever. I'm about to have a Saturn square, my final Saturn square coming up. How can I start working with my natal Saturn energy? How can I start healing that? How can I start working with that? So that way, come the Saturn return, we've already been working with those lessons. Saturn won't be so harsh on me, we can start to think that way. So yeah, I personally think that you should start working with your Saturn energy as early as you want. Obviously, when you're like, when you're working, when you're a teenager, if you're a teenager, you're gonna have to answer to some adult, and you'll need adult guidance. But when you're 19 to 22 and 27 to 30, those are going to be years where you can be thrown into the wolves, thrown into the world, and you might not have adult guidance. You might not. And that's very common for people around that age. Everyone expects you to handle it yourself sometimes, and that's a really tough thing. But you can start to work with that Saturn energy and just start like surrendering to it. Start asking yourself, how can you address things? So address things that you need to address, because Saturn is the kind of energy that wants you to handle it. So now I'm talking about how you can work with this energy prior to your Saturn return. Address those things that need to be addressed. Handle it. You can start to mentally prepare yourself and maybe learn about your natal Saturn and start disciplining yourself in that area. Start working hard in that area. You can maybe start to let go of things that is just not going to be coming with you when you level up into the next phase of adulthood. You start to detach from that kind of stuff. Leave yourself a little bit more flexible so Saturn can come in and do what it needs to do. You could start to manifest and have goals. So you could say, well, in my Saturn return, this is a big goal, and I will willing to work really hard and learn these lessons to do it. Like, Saturn, can you start to show me that? Start to put me on that path. You can start to figure out what you want to be. Even if you don't know what you should do for your Saturn return or whatever, you can at least start to imagine what you would be like in that next phase of adulthood. And maybe start to put that intention out there so Saturn can start to align you with it. Okay, you have to remember that Saturn does all the things that it does is for the greater good. It is for the greater good. And we have to sort of surrender to that process and trust that process. And anyone who has ever been through a Saturn return or a really tough Saturn square or something like that would tell you that. They would tell you, I look back at that moment and it was fucking tough and it sucked, but it was the moment that changed everything. It needed to happen. And a lot of healing has happened since then. A lot of burdens have been released and restrictions have been released since then. And so, yeah, if you also ever want to talk with an astrologer about Saturn, I offer that service. You can check out my link down below. I have a Saturn return reading. You can book it at whatever age you want. We'll talk about Saturn and how you can prepare for it. If you haven't had your Saturn return yet, or if you're in your Saturn return, what you can do to work with it and surrender to it. And I also want to tell you guys, you have a second Saturn return, because Saturn, like I said, keeps going in that process. So right after you have your Saturn return, then around the 34 to 36 mark, you'll get hit with your second. You'll get hit with another square. So let's say your Saturn's in Aries, right? We'll go back to that example. The Saturn's going to keep moving, and it'll be in Cancer once again. And that is when you're going to get hit again with your second square in that area. And then you'll get hit with your second opposition when it's in Libra. And then you'll get hit again with your last square when it's in Capricorn. And then you'll get hit again with your second return when it enters Aries again. Okay, so that second Saturn return happens late 50s, 57, 59 typically, is when you'll get hit with that second Saturn return, and you again level up. So just think of that as these are all points of leveling up in maturity. What's interesting about that is that these Saturn squares and oppositions will come roughly every 7 years. And what's interesting is the cells in our bodies actually change up every 7 years. It takes 7 years for all the old cells to cycle out and for us to have all new cells. That's a 7-year cycle. And so our biology is literally changing as well. And it's growing and it's maturing. That's why our taste buds change every 7 years. So I think we should maybe try to be like open to that process of like every 7 years things are going to switch up, and you can track that by tracking where Saturn is. And yeah, I believe in you, and I believe that you can use this energy to your advantage. Like I said, just start by watching Saturn videos on your natal chart and learning about it, and then applying those things to real life, and then talking out loud to Saturn about your intentions and your goals, and listening to signs from the universe about lessons you need to learn or where you need to put in more work and discipline, and believing in yourself. All right, don't be scared. I think that this cycle is actually quite beautiful. Without this cycle, we wouldn't have growth, we wouldn't have maturity, we wouldn't have progress. And so it's necessary. We wouldn't have healing either, because Saturn will pull you out of those negative, toxic cycles. It will pull you out. It'll start to at the 7-year mark, and if you're really not letting it, like it's gonna put in more energy. So if you restrict Saturn, if you try to deny it or try to fight Saturn back, it's gonna keep giving you heat. Trust me, it's gonna keep giving you heat. And it's ruthless. So surrender to Saturn is the point. I know when I was in that second Saturn return of mine, that square when you're around 19 to 22, and I was like, trying to figure it all out, I resisted the crap out of Saturn. I did. And that's why it got to the point where I had to get everything that I owned stolen. Saturn said, you won't listen, I'm literally going to blank your canvas. I'm literally going to give you nothing to cling on to, because everything that you own is gone. So I'm telling you, Saturn does not play. What's another thing that's interesting is I was working with a client about how she's just feeling a little bit lost again, and blah blah blah, and that everything's like just not working out. She's feeling a lot of resistance. And then I remember her age is about mid-30s, so I'm like, oh, you're probably hitting your like second square there, your second Saturn square. And I was watching a TikTok video on another person who was talking about them and their experience while being in their mid-30s, and how that was like a point where they had to relearn everything again. And so I think that's interesting, this like point where you're in your mid-30s and you're like, okay, I can't act like I'm 26 anymore. Like, I have to relearn everything. I need to relearn how to do my makeup, how I like to take care of my body. That's another thing. Every 7 years you may need to change up the routines for your body because of this energy. And so you may have to like just relearn yourself, relearn your own biology, your own physics, your own mental and emotional and spiritual limitations as well. And really, I think what's important is use this opportunity every 7 years when Saturn hits you. If you can, you're already in that process of like breaking out of a karmic loop. So purge, like work with energy workers, or if you prefer like therapists, or if you prefer any type of life coach, or even a physical health coach, whatever, work with people to get the energy out of your body, all right? To get those blockages unstuck and get it out of your body, okay? Because we can carry pain with us for a very long time. We can carry certain traumas and emotions with us for a very long time. And these points where Saturn is, kind of trying to unravel things anyway, those are great points to also let Saturn unravel some of the hard stuff and the difficult stuff. That's like the plus here, is that things are changing up for the better, right? So, things that blind spots in your life, that you see them clear as day. People in your life, that you can't trust, clear as day. Problems in your life, they are clear as day. And so that's a blessing here, is like you don't have to suffer anymore. Saturn comes in every 7 years to just remove suffering, in my opinion, if we're working with the energy. And if you're ignoring in that energy, it builds. Like I said, Saturn's like, all right, I'll get you at the next square. And then you ignore it. Saturn's like, all right, fine, I'll get you when you hit that Saturn return. And trust me, Saturn return is like the buildup. It's the most energy, the most power, the most just surge of Saturn energy into your life. And you can make that a rewarding thing, or you can make that, a hard thing. That's the thing with Saturn. Not afraid to give those hard lessons. All right, I think that is all I have to say about Saturn and Saturn returns. If you have any more questions, you can comment that down below. Just make sure to follow me on like other social media platforms, because I love to answer questions like on Twitter or like TikTok or Instagram sometimes. And if you guys want to book a reading, like I said, check out the link in my bio. I got you. I have other fun stuff in there too, like my Patreon, my tarot course, all my socials, things of that nature. You'll find it all in the bio. I really hope that this helps you out. And you have a wonderful day. Bye.